Hi, and welcome to Outdoor Living Supply Academy. I'm at Stone Garden, an outdoor living supply location in Wilmington, North Carolina. And where I'm standing was originally a natural turf that was struggling and not doing so well. So we're taking the opportunity to replace it with our new Golden Vale synthetic turf line. So we're going to do an installation overview of the Golden Vale synthetic turf. So let's get started by talking about the tools that you'll need to create a successful synthetic turf installation. Obviously, you'll need some basic hand tools like shovels, rakes, brooms, tape measures, and especially make sure you have some good compaction equipment, as compaction of the subbase and bedding layer are crucially important. Some of the tools that are very specific to turf that you'll need will include a power broom, a carpet stretcher or knee kicker, carpet knives, a notched trowel for spreading the adhesive, and a drop spreader for installing the infill. So how we got to this point right now is we started with the original area, we removed the existing turf, and we excavated down about 4 to 6 inches. Then with this, we have our original rock perimeter, but we wanted to have a more clean line for the edging of the turf. And so we used a bender board material that we installed along the inside. And this is a plastic composite, extremely flexible, so you can get really tight radiuses with it. When installing the bender board, there's a few things that you need to take into consideration. The finished height should be about a ½ an inch below your total surface height, so that when the turf comes over, it ends up being about flush with your finished surface. The other thing with the stakes is to put them into the ground, put a couple of screws in each stake, but then put stakes about every 3 to 4 feet. So you can see we've got them set apart about 4 feet. And then the stakes themselves should also be about a ½ inch down below, so that it doesn't interfere with the turf when we go ahead and bring the turf over the top. After the edge restraint is installed, then we're adding in a base material, a gravel. So if you've installed pavers, it's very much the same process. So in our case, we used a 3/4 inch dense graded aggregate. So our design is going to have the water shed off the surface of the synthetic turf. But if you wanted the design to have the water penetrate down, you can use an open graded aggregate for the base material as well. So at this point, we're putting in the base material. So basically the subgrade below the bedding layer. And we want to take and rake this out as smooth as possible, get as many imperfections out of it as we can. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect, but we want to make sure that as we run our compactor over it, we're not feeling any major undulations. So once you've got your base material leveled out, we want to make sure that we get good compaction. Just like on paver installations, compaction is crucially important. So with us, we're doing about 3 to 6 inches of base material in this scenario. A compactor like this is only going to be able to compact adequately about 1.5 inches, 2 inches. So we want to make sure we do our compaction in multiple layers. So we've got that set up right now to where we're at. So I'm going to go ahead and fire this up and do our final compaction before we do our bedding layer. So with the base material installed and the final height about 1 to 2 inches below the bender board, our next step is to install the bedding layer. And in this case, because again, our design calls for our water to shed off of the surface, we're going to go ahead and use a stone dust that compacts up nice and firm and really limits the amount of moisture that's going to soak into it. So let's get going on that. So we've gotten to the point now where I've got the bedding layer installed. What I did is put it in, loosely raked it to about the height of the top of the bender board. I've got some minor undulations. This area doesn't have to be perfect. My next step is to go ahead and compact this, make sure that we've got really good compaction on that. And then I'm gonna come back in and do a finish layer on the bedding layer, kind of knocking down any significant high spots, filling in any significant low spots, and making sure whatever surface is on here is gonna be nice for our synthetic turf. The other thing we did in this particular application is the center of our area is actually slightly mounded. That's gonna give us our drainage off the edges in basically all the directions. And so we wanna make sure as we're raking this out, we continue to maintain that center as being high in this application. So let's get going with the compaction and we can finish this off and get it ready for turf. So what I'm doing now is trying to put a finish grade on our bedding layer. And this is a really important step because really whatever you get this to look like is kind of how your turf is gonna be. So for us, we're doing kind of a lawn area. And so there can be some minor undulations in this. You're not really gonna notice it. But if this was a putting green, we'd wanna spend significantly more time in this step because we need to make sure the putting green is perfect so that we get a true roll on the ball. So you'll notice as I'm raking, it's not just pulling one direction. What I'm doing is I'm pulling through, I'm looking for high spots and looking for low spots. Then I'll change direction and move this material around so that I know everywhere I go if I've got a high spot or a low spot. The other thing is with this bender board in place, it's a nice guide for the rake. So you can actually put the edge of the rake on it and use it to kind of get your edge height just right around the perimeter of the turf area. So as we go through, it's a matter of pulling material off the high areas, spreading it down into the low areas. This is a slow and steady technique. The other thing, as far as an advantage goes, is a rake like this, which is a 3-foot wide rake. If you can get a 4-foot wide rake, it helps because the wider your rake, the more undulations you're gonna find, fill in the lower spots, and really become a much more accurate with the final grade in this scenario. So as soon as we finish this, we'll put one more compaction on it and we'll move on to installing the turf. So we've got the bedding layer completed and we're getting ready to install the turf, but I wanted to point out a couple of key things about the bedding layer. So when you look at it, we do have the center of this is the high spot. Everything is gonna flow off in all directions. So we should have eliminated any drainage issues that could have possibly popped up. Another thing to look at is our final surface height with the bender board is flush so that when we do the turf install, we'll be able to bring the turf right over the top of it and it'll be flush with the stone on the outside. So as I've spent a significant amount of time taking care of all the high spots and the low spots, we've got a nice even surface throughout the whole area. And I think we're ready to go ahead and start installing the turf. So when your turf shows up on your site, it's going to be rolled up and shrink wrapped just like this. It should be cut to the lengths that you ordered. And so really when a couple hours before you're ready to start installing the turf, you wanna cut it open, lay it out, and let it sit in the sun for a couple of hours to get acclimated. It warms up, it's gonna be more pliable. You'll be much happier when you put it down because it's gonna be easier to move around, easier to stretch in place. So let's go ahead and cut it open and we'll show you what that looks like. So we're at the point now where we're gonna start to put our turf down and prep for the seaming. We've had our turf sitting out in the sun for a couple of hours, so it's acclimated to the climate around it. Should be easier to use, a little bit more flexible. And so we've got it unrolled out on our turf area. But the one thing that the turf comes with is what we call a salvage edge, and it's just an excess of the underlayment from the turf. So we want to cut that off before we do any seaming. So we've got it laid out, and it's gonna come like that on every roll that you buy. So what we do is take it, we're gonna fold it back, and the manufactured edge may or may not be intact. So what we want to do is come in a couple of rows of the threads, and then we're going to cut that off as well. So I'm going to take a good carpet knife like this. I'm going to line up right in between the threads, and I'm just going to cut right down the line, keeping it tight. And the straighter the line you can get, the better the seam. In our case, we were doing a demonstration to show contractors how to do this, so we enlisted their help in setting the seam up. So now that we have the edge of the turf trimmed up and ready for the seam, let's go ahead with the seaming process. So the first thing you need to do in the seaming process is to lay the two pieces of turf together, get them dry fit and tight up against each other. This may require you to do some stretching with the knee kicker and make sure that there's no gappage between the underlayment material of the turf, or there's no overlap as well. We want to just have them side by side as tight as possible to make sure that that seam becomes invisible when it's completely done. So a pro tip that might help you is to make a mark on the bender board or stone perimeter around your turf area, and then when you pull the turf back, you can actually use that mark to line up the center of your seam tape. By doing this, it ensures that you're able to get full coverage with the adhesive on both sides of the seam. So when you have the seam tape lined up and in place, make sure you put some sort of weight on each end to hold it into place, and then you can start applying the glue. Important to note that this glue is incredibly sticky and will stick to everything, including your hands and your clothes, and especially the turf if you get it in. So we want to make sure that we are extremely clean during this process. So putting glue down on the seam tape, we want to start to spread it with a notched trowel. And this is important because we want to ensure that we get full coverage of the adhesive over the entire surface area of the seam tape. So spread across the entire area down the full length of the seam tape, making sure you cover as much of the surface area as possible. But at the same time, we want to make sure we don't have too much glue left on the surface, because as you put the two pieces of turf down into the adhesive, we don't want to have any adhesive seeping up through the joint. If it does seep up through the seam, it's going to catch onto the blades of the turf, and it's going to create significant problems with the finished look of the seam. So to ensure that we don't get too much adhesive on the seam tape, after that first coat goes down, you can go back and with your notch trowel, go ahead and scrape the entire surface to get a nice even coating. Once you ensure that you have adhesive covering the entire seam tape, that's when we take one side and press it down into the adhesive. And the reason we need more than one person for this is now as we lay down the second side of the turf, we want to maintain the one edge pulled back, and one person can lay the turf in a small amount at a time. One person can hold that turf back, making sure it doesn't fall into the adhesive. And then if needed, you can have a third person that can tighten up the joint or tighten up the seam if it's required. And we do this again with the knee kicker stretcher. So as we go through, this is a slow and steady process. We want to make sure that we're not overlapping that underlayment, and we want to make sure that we are as close as we can. And we also don't want to push those blades of grass down into the adhesive. So you're pulling the blades back, pushing the underlayment together, and then kind of weaving the turf together to hide the seam as it goes forward. So you can see we have our turf down now. We've got our seam completed, and the next step is going to be to cut and trim all of the edges into place around our border. So what I did over here was, to make my life a little bit easier, I went ahead and cut off all the heavy excess turf that we had, and now I've really only got about 4 or 5 inches of additional turf over the edge. This is going to give me a much easier time pulling it back and doing the detailed cutting that has to be done for this next step. So let's take a look, see how we do that. So you can see I cut all that excess off and I only have a few extra inches. What that allows me to do is fold this back very easily. Just take about, I don't know, 6 to 8 inches and cut relief cuts in. And now, in order to do this detail cut, I only have a few inches at a time. Come in right up next to the rock. This is kind of a visual, you know, I'm not measuring, just using the stone to guide. And I cut those few inches off, and I can tuck that black underlayment down, and it holds into place. The next step after that will be to come in and screw this, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But for now, just kind of see how this works. Fold it back. Cut a few inches and use the rock as a guide. So now that we've got all the trimming done around the perimeter, I'm going to go back and seal in the edges with these 3/4 inch lath screws. We're going to go through the turf down into the bender board, and that's going to secure the edges so that we don't have any lifting if we have high winds or anything like that. So for this, it's just a matter of getting a screwdriver and the 3/4 inch lath screws. Important technique here though is to find the bender board beneath and pull the turf away so that you're exposing the under liner, and screw down, and that way you're not pinching any turf and the screw is hidden down below. So when considering a Golden Vale synthetic turf installation, you want to think through the whole process ahead of time. There are many infill options for you to use, and each infill can be used for different scenarios. So over here we've got basic silica sand, typically available in white or black, can be used across just about any installation, but with utility areas and such like that, it's probably your best option because it is the least expensive. Next to that, we actually have another silica sand, but it's been coated in a green coloring. And this really helps when you're doing putting turfs, for example, where the silica sand is going to be filled pretty close to the surface. With the green coloring, you're really not going to notice it a whole lot. And the Zeofill is great for pet areas when you have several pets or large dogs, or maybe it's a pet daycare type application, because Zeofill helps to break down bacteria caused by the dog waste and can also have an odor blocking element to the product as well. And the last one that we've chosen to use on our project is called T-Cool. And this has antibacterial properties as well, but doesn't have the odor absorbing element. But what's great about the T-Cool is that in an area where you're going to be walking on it with bare feet, or in an area where you might have some traffic, T-Cool actually can help lower the surface temperature of the synthetic turf. So we chose this option, being that we're in a display. People might want to take their shoes off and walk on it, and hopefully we'll keep that a little bit cooler in the installation. So as we approach the final steps of our installation, we're going to be putting in the infill. And we want to install the infill using a drop spreader because that helps us install the infill as evenly as possible across the entire surface. When we do that, we also need to broom in the infill so that it helps the blades stand up. So we're using the broom against the grain of the turf so that the sand or the infill goes down to the bottom, it stands the blades up, and it makes for a natural look and a natural feel. Ideally, I would want to use a power broom for this because it's much faster and easier on the body. But unfortunately, the power broom we have isn't working today, so you're going to see me using a push broom. It's not ideal, but it works in a pinch. Well, here it is, our completed synthetic turf installation. It's a great transformation in this space. So for further information and questions, hit the email link below, or if you're interested in checking out Golden Vale Synthetic Turf, check out one of our outdoor living supply locations, or stop by here at Stone Garden in Wilmington, North Carolina.